Federal dollars going to a book on Russian wine and a mariachi apprenticeship program are just a few of the highlights of the 4th annual Federal Fumbles Report. The study highlights an inefficiency in government spending while intending to spark broader debate on finding solutions to rein in the federal debt. Joining us now, the author of that report and member of the Homeland Security Committee, Republican Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma. And an incredible list. We will get to that in just a moment. But first of all, Rand Paul says he'll be voting for repeal of the president's emergency declaration. He says there will be other Republicans. Will you be one of them?
I'm still waiting for the documentation, actually, from the White House. The White House is supposed to still get us the information on the military side of what they're asking for, and we've yet to receive that yet. So we've got both documentation on the legal aspects and then where they're going to take those funds from. They've got 3 funds they're trying to pull from in this. 2 of them are non-emergency. They're just statutory normal. They have reprogramming on. One of them is emergency declaration on the finances, and waiting to get the details on that still. And the votes next week in the Senate. Yeah.
I mean, this is, do you believe that this is an emergency to be declared?
There is a serious problem there, and whether you call it emergency or a crisis, or as President Obama called it, a humanitarian crisis, there's a problem. And it's families and it's individuals that are rushing at the border in very, very high numbers. So we've got to be able to find a way to be able to manage this.
They're coming in higher numbers now for certain reasons, but the numbers actually over time have been going down, as you know, sir.
Well, it kind of depends on where you take that from.
Yes, but if you call it a problem, there are a lot of problems that the government works on. Is this an emergency that deserves emergency funds?
So that's where we're waiting to be able to get the declaration. There are 3 accounts, as I mentioned before, that the White House has asked for those dollars. 2 of those accounts, there's statutory authority already there to be able to move those. There's no emergency requirement. That's at the discretion of the executive branch on how they can use those funds. Asset forfeiture fund, one fund that deals with drug interdiction that they can use in different ways. The 3rd one actually is military construction. That's the only one that would require emergency action, and we have not seen the documentation on that one yet. And so I'm going to wait to be able to get that. I wish the House would have waited until the documentation came out to actually vote on it so they would know what they're actually voting on. We haven't seen it yet.
So what in these documents would tell you that this is an emergency that deserves federal emergency dollars?
Well, it depends on, again, it depends on the account that they're taking it from and where that is actually documented in law that they can actually use it. The White House has said they have statutory authority. They've got to actually show us what that statutory authority is. The other 2 areas, there is no doubt they have statutory authority on. And that's about, by the way, about $4.5 billion of those dollars. There's no reason to doubt because, again, it's clear, plain language.
So what would play into your decision? I mean, wouldn't you be concerned that the Democrats could deem something a, quote, emergency? And I know you keep talking about different funds that it might come from. I'm asking you if this is an emergency that deserves a emergency funds and a declaration of emergency, that you would support that. And would you be concerned about, if you don't think it's an emergency, you just think it's a problem, as you just said earlier, sir, would you be concerned that Democrats would take a problem and call it an emergency as well?
Sure it would. That's why the statutory authority is so incredibly important. If you're having to stretch the statutory authority for what the request is, then that's always going to be an issue. Now, whether you call this, like I said, an emergency, a crisis, a problem, whatever it is, the word that you actually use, we have more people crossing the border right now as family units and as children in the first 5 months of this year than we had all of last year, or that we had the year before, or that we had the year before. We have an enormous rush at our border right now of children. And as the Washington Post has done a story on, and human smugglers are actually advertising a discount if you bring a child now to be able to actually cross the border illegally, because it's easier to be able to get people across the border with a child than it is a single adult male coming. So we have what they have is Central America, what they're calling adoptions now, when they can actually pick up a child from that area and say, I'll take your child to America to actually go get educated because it's cheaper if we'll be able to split the cost basically of transiting. We're talking about real human trafficking of children that are unrelated to some of these adults. Many of them are related to adults. They may be uncles or cousins or such, but many of these are unrelated as well that are actually moving because it's cheaper and we're incentivizing it. We have to address that humanitarian crisis. This is growing.
Yeah, I just don't know what a wall does for anything you just said. I mean, but I'll look forward to hearing how you vote on this. I feel like we're speaking a different language. I mean, we're talking about a wall, and you're talking about things that have nothing to do with the wall.
So in areas where there's a wall, you don't have this issue. They're crossing in between border areas, so you've got to have additional security. You've got to have personnel. You have additional technology. And in some areas, urban areas especially, you've got to be able to have some kind of barrier there. But most of the border will never have a wall on. You don't need it. But we do need layers of security, just like you have layers of security probably getting into the building you're in. There are multiple layers of security of people and process that you have to go through. We'll have that at the border as well.
All right, we'll leave it there. The Federal Fumbles Report, which is the annual collection of examples of waste, what's at the top of the list?
So we actually detail what the problem is and try to lay this out. It's $22 trillion in total debt right now that we're never going to get on top of until we have real economic growth and sustained economic growth, and until we actually pay attention to it. Unfortunately, in the Congress and across most of the country, no one's talking about debt and deficit anymore. It's just dropped off the map. And so I tried to be able to highlight some process. This is our fourth time to be able to release a report like this. Previous reports, we've outlined about $800 billion in ways that we can actually save money in the long term. This report, we focus more on the process areas. How do you fix the budget process, for instance? How do we stop government shutdowns? Government shutdowns actually waste money rather than save money long term. So we lay out a bipartisan solution to be able to solve the issue with government shutdowns. Try to figure out how we're going to actually get to a budget process that works on saving money, not just on spending money. So there are a few examples, as you mentioned before, about the money that was spent on studying Soviet-era wines that I can understand why the wine industry would pay for that. I don't understand why taxpayers would pay for that. There's some examples we laid out like that, but most of the book is just larger process issues trying to solve it.
Senator, it's Willie Geist. You pointed to the most recent government shutdown, the longest ever in this country. As you point out, it was a colossal waste of time, it was a colossal waste of money, and it was a colossal pain that was placed on a lot of government employees in this country. You've introduced legislation. Can you actually stop a government shutdown? Can you create legislation that says we will no longer have these in our country?
There is. As you know, government shutdowns aren't new. These go back decades and decades. Been done a lot of administrations. Maggie Hassan and I, a Democratic senator from New Hampshire, she and I have presented a solution. A lot of people say if you cut off pay of members of Congress, that'll solve it. I always smile and say you should meet some of the members of Congress. They're multimillionaires, many of them. Their pay is a rounding error to what they get in their other checks that come in. My focus is the main thing that you can put on pressure on Congress is no one leaves until the work is done. You can't leave while there's still work to be done. When we went into the shutdown mode in December, everyone left for Christmas. That should have never happened. You should stay nights, weekends. We should have what's called mandatory quorum calls so that everyone stays in, debate continues until you're actually finished. Do that not only for the House and the Senate, our staff, both in states and here, but also for the Office of Management and Budget for the White House. Everybody stays until we get the job done.
Amen.
And you have a continuing in the meantime to be able to make sure you hold federal workers harmless and you hold the American people harmless. Put the pressure on where the pressure needs to be.
Senator, you're a conservative.
Yes, sir, I am.
And the Republican Party was always the party, broadly speaking, of cutting taxes and limited government. And I appreciate you carrying on the tradition of the waste book. That's great with the Fumbles book. But what is the distinction going to be between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party? The Republicans used to call the Democratic Party the tax and spend party. But if the Republicans and the Democrats are going to be the same on ever-growing and ever-increasing budgets and deficits, what's the future of the Republican Party, or how do you defend President Trump's administration and the Republican Party if we are just continuing 77% increase in deficit spending? Where does it end?
So that's why I raised this not as a partisan book. You'll find many illustrations there that are both Republican and Democrat and bipartisan solutions that are in it, because this is a bipartisan problem. This is not a Republican-Democrat issue. This is an American issue. We have to have economic growth, and I've had a lot of folks push back and say the tax cuts that happened last year contributed to the deficit. The facts are actually coming out different. Yesterday, I laid out on the floor that the numbers for FY17 and 18 are in. Tax revenue went up actually $14 billion last year. After the tax cut actually occurred, we had greater revenue. But if we don't have economic activity, then you have growing amounts of social safety nets that we'll continue to do to be able to take care of people, the SNAP program, housing assistance, other unemployment assistance. If you don't have a growing economy,